We gather this weekend in the liturgical year of the church, as we referenced the beginning of the Mass, having just completed the first two seasons of our liturgical year, the seasons of Advent and Christmas. And now we enter what the church calls ordinary time. This year for about five and a half weeks until Lent begins on February 22nd, and then resuming after the Easter season on May 28th, the Solemnity of Pentecost. And this term, ordinary time, comes from the Latin word ordinalis, which simply means numbered. And the church simply counts the number of Sundays and successive weeks throughout the year. But whenever we hear that term, ordinary, I think it brings that negative connotation that can mean uneventful or unimportant. And yet I think when we hear that term, it should remind us of just the opposite. For God has entered into our human history. In his incarnation, he has united his divine nature to our human nature. And so he has united all that is human to himself, giving everything a sacred and a exalted reality. There can be nothing that is ordinary now, because all has been made extraordinary in Christ. The gospel that we just heard from is a very short one, and if I could use that term, almost ordinary. It's so different from the ones we heard the last few weeks. There's no miraculous birth, angels proclaiming that birth, wise men following a star. Now there's just John the Baptist, Jesus walking toward him, and John's pronouncement of who he is. But then again, isn't this the most remarkable and extraordinary event imaginable? God is walking on our earth now, and since these moments of his life and death and resurrection, everything is different. And here in the Eucharist, he comes to us to feed us with himself. You know, so often in our human experience, we see celebrities that give concerts or shows, and there are hordes of crowds. It is almost, there, we would say, there's a great buzz when a kind of event like that occurs. But there is nothing that is like what occurs here, because God comes to us. And there is nothing that is more important than what happens here. This encounter with him that is meant to transform us, to give us an enduring peace and joy in that communion with the living God, a change in our very being that is meant to lead us to holiness. In our second reading, St. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. At that time, the community suffers from such great issues, dissensions, and difficulties. The letter is a very long one. Some scholars think it's a series of letters that is brought together. But look how Paul begins it all. He sends his peace, and he reminds them that they have been sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be holy. It's the completion of what was first promised to the chosen people. In our first reading, we hear from Isaiah that God has called them to be a light to the nations so that his salvation might reach the ends of the earth. And so for us, but in an infinitely now greater way. For here again, God comes to transform us. And the transformation that will occur will not be in a dramatic or an earth-shattering way. We can't expect some psychological ecstasy to maintain us, or frankly, to even ever occur. But what we can expect is that if we open ourselves up to what occurs here, we will then come to a deeper awareness and understanding of God's presence among us. And so then, in all the ordinariness of life, our minds and our hearts will be filled with the extraordinary love and power of God. In the gospel, John the Baptist testifies as to the identity of Christ. In this way, he is accomplishing what God has called John the Baptist to do. That was the holiness that he was to attain. And we too are called to do the same, to testify to God's presence in whatever vocation and careers, in our family and in our communities, in the normal moments of each and every day. Because each moment, as mundane and ordinary as it can be, is really extraordinary. Because each moment is charged with the very life and presence of God. If we remember this, then all those ordinary things that we do every day, we will come to see all of them for what they really are. Opportunities for us to experience an ever-growing communion with Christ, growing in that love that he wants to share with us now, always, and in all things.